got it. Yep. All right. Okay. Welcome everyone. We're going to get started. All right. So, thanks for joining us for the final event of the 2025 Platypus Oceania regional conference. This event is a public workshop with members of the International Bolshevik Tendency, titled "The Prospects for Socialism Today." We're joined by Amal, Samaha, and who have flown all the way from New Zealand. Amal Samaha is a supporter of the International Bolshevik Tendency. She has written for publications including 1917, Cosmonauts and the Spin-Off, and recently completed a thesis on the historiography of futility or Waitangi. She is an Australian Lebanese trans woman and lives in Wellington, New Zealand. And Max Charter is a 26-year-old trans woman based in Wellington, New Zealand. She is a supporter of the International Bolshevik Tendency and the Bolshevik Club at Victoria University of Wellington, at which she studies law. So we'll begin by asking some basic kind of framing questions just to find out a bit more about our guests today and find out a little bit about their outlook with respect to socialism. So I'll kick things off with the first question, and then we'll just kind of have a conversational kind of dialogue between me, Ryan, and our guests from the IDT today. Just to set things up, can I just ask you guys broadly, like, how did you come to the left? What's your background on the left? That sort of thing?
You want to?
Yeah, sure. I discovered anarchism on Reddit around 2017. That was sort of my first foray into vaguely left-wing politics. It was even the kind of anarchist circles that weren't all the way hostile to Marx and Engels, and I got to reading a little bit and then there, but I think I very quickly found that a politics of just being kind of perpetually angry about everything and trying to get everyone else on their same level of anger was kind of a dead end, and for a while I kind of drifted. Now, around 2021, I sort of kind of came into the orbit of the International Socialist Organization, Aotearoa, the local Cliffites, and coming to a baseline understanding of some of what Trotskyism is, of sort of a Leninist idea of the state, a willingness to sort of fight for that kind of revolution, while also, having a willingness to grapple with the legacy of Stalinism was interesting to me, but I very quickly found the ISL itself to not be very interesting in this regard. I joined a small group of activists within the trans struggle around this time, and that is when I met a couple of members of the International Bolshevik Tendency. My girlfriend at the time was also very much floating around them, sort of interested in them, and I think through seeing how they sort of approached the trans struggle with seriousness and an eye towards militancy really impressed me and got me talking to them a lot more, and I found myself pretty well convinced with their approach to politics in general, and
Cool.
So I say that I've been a communist for the last 15 years. When I say this, people ask, "Oh, how old are you?" I did it very young. I got recruited to Catholicism while I was still in high school by assault coming onto campus. As I'm sure is a reasonably common story, I think. That was around the time of Julian Assange getting arrested, and then the next year Occupy. And so I was around for Occupy in Perth, when there was a protest against the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, had the police horses unleashed upon us and things like this, and it was a reasonably radicalising experience there. So I was a sort of paper member of SALT for a little bit. I sort of drifted away from left politics because I didn't really get educated in left politics as part of SALT, or really engaged that much, I suppose. When I moved to Aotearoa, New Zealand, I sort of hovered around the ISO as well for a little bit. But I was also like sort of graduate. This was around the time of like Stalinist memes online being really, really big. And so I got a little bit Stalinophilic during this time. I joined an organization called Organize Aotearoa, which was a sort of broad Big Tent party. Well, they wouldn't call party. That was a sort of a mix of people who were, I suppose, very right social democrats, some right anarchists, I suppose a centrist grouping as well. There was a couple of McNairists, and a couple of sort of the centrist grouping I'm talking about was a bit Stalinist as well. And so I was part of that little bit of it. I eventually got very disillusioned with Organize Aotearoa's Big Tent approach in stages. I started to see some benefits to having a more united worldview. And originally I was sort of attracted to some kind of syncretic merging that are called decolonial communism, which never was particularly defined as anything. But I was also very involved in a land occupation at Ikamatau, which is an isthmus south of Auckland. And as part of that, there was some fights over sort of, whether we should use direct action tactics, and there ended up being a big split with the right wing of OA as well. And that started a process of burnout that went for several years. And eventually I got involved in the same Trans Rights United Front that Max was talking about, came into contact with the IBT, and for very similar reasons to Max, I ended up getting closer and closer to the IBT's politics. By that point, I had sort of drifted closer and closer to the point where at some point just asked me, why are you not a Trotskyist? And I couldn't give an answer because I'd come to be gradually recruited to the idea of permanent revolution, particularly by reading Hannah Batatu, the great social historian of Iraq. His history of the Iraqi almost revolution of 1959 sort of made me realize that actually there was a lot of histories of revolutions out there which had failed because of Stalinist stagism. That was what eventually brought me into the IBT. Yeah.
Great. You raised a really interesting point about how there was this moment in, I'm guessing kind of the mid to late 20th century, talk about the rise of like communist memes and that sort of thing. Well, I'm wondering why you think there was that phenomenon, and at the same time there was less of an impulse for people to align themselves with Trotskyism generally, / if you would agree with that or not.
I think that's definitely true. I mean, I don't think that the Trotskyist groups were recruiting very much at all. I suppose in that era, it was a lot of people having become radicalised through the sort of Corbyn and Bernie Sanders kind of left liberal to right social democrat kind of politics, and from that sort of looking for something more radical, whatever form that took, sort of just having a knee-jerk, we're going to support whatever the West is against kind of politics, I think came out of that pretty naturally, and led to me and a lot of my peers getting quite attracted to Stalinism. And I think that a large part of the reason why Trotskyism was not popular in that milieu is just because, as part of the Soviet Union collapsing, some of the only Trotskyist groups that survived were groups like Cliffites, various groups that didn't defend the Soviet Union, and thus their politics wasn't really bound up in its collapse. And they tended to survive a lot better, and so Trotskyism at that time was seen as, and I think still is, seen as fairly synonymous with Cliffism and these various, social patriotic, often Western chauvinist, often highly degenerated politics. Yeah.
a certain affinity that sometimes crops up between members of Platypus and members of IBT internationally is that we take an interest in the history of the sectarian left, notably Trotskyism and its various kind of like fragments, whereas like, I might contend that a lot of the mainstream left would just like write it off and like, oh, they're just wreckers, we don't need to take that seriously or something like that. Whereas Platypus, will read like Lenin and the Vanguard Party, will read these old like Spartacist pamphlets, Genesis of Pavlovism, all that sort of thing. In fact, I don't know, but I feel like among the left, it's like of the pamphlets that the Spartacist League is still selling, Platypus seem to be the main audience for actually buying them, the physical versions at least. And when I was reading just before the Who We Are kind of bio that in International Bolshevik Tendency, the 1917 journal, I was interested that you mentioned, for instance, Pavlovism by name, which is part of the Genesis of Pavlovism pamphlet. And without going into the nitty-gritty of like what is Pavlovism and that sort of thing, I'm interested in how and what distinguishes for you the why it's plausible to take up the mantle of the Bolsheviks today in context of the various fragmentation of Trotskyism into various groups, if that makes sense. If that's not too broad a question.
Yeah, sure. So I think that for us, the taking up the mantle of Bolshevism is simply just to signal that we are committed to an orthodox view of how we see Bolshevik Leninism, and which was the label that Trotsky used for Trotskyism in his time, as it were. And I think that we might easily have taken a different label as well, but there are only so many sect names as well.
Maybe I'll then say, so broadly in the question of what is Trotskyism, maybe let's phrase this. Most of the people in Melbourne, as you were saying, and maybe in New Zealand as well, have this experience of a kind of ambient cliffism. Mm-hmm. Like the Trotskyists we do encounter are either Cliffites, perhaps some Mandelites here and there, and some Grantites maybe. But the sort of default understanding of Trotskyism is this kind of 1960s, 70s British Trotskyism, whereas the IBT and the Spartacist tradition comes from American Trotskyism. So maybe you could elucidate for our audience sort of the American experience of Trotskyism and how that is somewhat unique compared to other Trotskyism.
I can give a better answer to the previous question, which also touches on that a bit, which is that I suppose the practical benefit of calling yourself Bolsheviks is that when you're being directly compared in people's eyes to a Cliffite group, which is tending not to try and claim any kind of mantle of Bolshevism or is reluctant to call itself Trotskyism, just coming out and saying we're Bolsheviks, we've got a big red flag up there, means that we're immediately attracting the people who are going to be closer to our politics. It's got an immediate practical utility when we're trying to talk to people who are also wanting to talk to the Cliffites and things like this. It sorts out people into and clarifies politics automatically a bit. As for I suppose the British tradition of Trotskyism has been so intimately connected with Labour Party entryism, and this being very much connected to a lot of the degenerate forms of Trotskyism, like Grantism, and Cliffism, although I think that there's a certain parallel between Cliff and Shackman as well. I think, we tend not to think of our politics so much as a specific American import of Trotskyism, but I think that there is a reason why the British tradition did tend to. It didn't have an equivalent of Robertson. I guess the closest thing was Healy, and Healy went off and became rather odd. Yeah.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Perhaps I'm thinking more of in these one of the founding sort of proto-Spartacist documents that in defense of a revolutionary program, 1962, they very much reference a document of James Cannon from 1946 called Theses on the American Revolution. And in some sense, that carrying on in the American tradition, there was a conception that the socialist revolution was a continuation of the American Revolution. Famously, Eugene Debs said things like, July 4th is a socialist holiday, and this was carried on then by a lot of the IWW people who sort of moved into the Socialist Workers' Party as well. So the question is, to what connection was there perhaps a sense of the American Empire, a party in the core of the early 20th century capital, what shaped a kind of different Trotskyism to perhaps the kind of British Trotskyism, which was in sort of declining empire at that stage?
I honestly don't think I can answer that one. It's a new thought to me that I haven't weighed up in my mind. Yeah.
Okay.
Well, maybe we can tease it out as we go and see what thoughts emerge. I was what I was prompted by when you were talking about claiming the mantle of Bolshevism and hanging a red flag and that drawing people, and they were naturally gravitated towards that. Amal, what I thought of was how there are different ways we can think of what it means to take up the mantle of, let's just say, revolution, right? There's one which is like pragmatic. It's like, okay, this is the most, like, you see a group with a red flag on campus and like young people will think like, okay, this is the most militant group. I want to be militant, I want to be radical, so I want to go to it. But that doesn't necessarily distinguish a group like IBT, like Plenty of Malice do that as well, right? Another way of looking at it though might be the distinction that you raised implicitly between like orthodoxy and heterodoxy. And I think that's what I find interesting about the way that you introduce yourselves, and that's why I kind of raised the Pabloism thing. I wasn't trying to like to kind of go into the nitty gritty. It was more just that like you self-consciously as an organization recognize that there is a certain I don't know if lineage is the right word, but like a current that stems from 1917, and that various liquidations have occurred along the way, and that it means something to be orthodox, yes. Right? Whereas I think there's a different emphasis among people that are just that gravitate towards progressivism generally in the broad umbrella, whether you're like in the Greens or you're the fight or whatever. Is that something that you have thought about much? Is that something you're capable of expanding on, either of you?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of tendency on the left right now to sort of want to brush over history as not see it as that important, sort of where ideas come from and how ideas have been developed over time. Like, the Russian Revolution was a workers' revolution. It was the first one on the scale of an entire country, and that is an incredibly big deal. But that is not to say that the October 1917 can be recreated by simply going through every single motion that the Bolsheviks went through. But I think you see a tendency in recognizing this for a lot of people to kind of dismiss the idea that there are concrete lessons that can be sort of drawn out from that to sort of a tendency that when there are big shake-ups in the international landscape to kind of want to seek to throw out all the ideas before and come up with fresh new ideas. Now, of course, changes in the world situation, that does necessitate sort of looking at them, examining them, often coming up with new ideas. But I think there's a sense in which we represent a willingness to not drop everything at the slightest sign of trouble, to sort of maintain a continuity with these ideas, not necessarily a strict adherence, but to build off them, develop them, and change them when it is necessary to change them. Yeah.
Well, what's interesting about that, and sorry, I'll let you speak, Amal, if you want. I'll just pick up on a thread that I thought was really interesting that you raised, and that is that, like, there's something implicit in that like, in your journal being named 1917, and in Platypus, like we have 1917 in our web URL, Platypus 1917, and that like you seem to be illustrating that 1917 is a certain problem that is like still kind of in a certain way haunting the left. And there are other groups that will, of course, claim the mantle of 1917. They'll talk about the Bolsheviks and they'll read the Second Revolution or whatever else. But as you say, like perhaps 1917 for them might be treated as a set of like solutions or answers that just need to be reproduced. But of course, what we know is that things have changed, but there's a difference as well. Or rather, I put that wrong. Things have changed, but there's a continuity as well. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I think, and I'm going to butcher some Hegel quote here, I think he says the old comes in the skin of the new in the skin of the old. I think that for me that meaning is that there is a kind of revolutionary continuity. It comes not only in the form of ideas, but the kind of organisational forms and traditions that those ideas are bound together with, and which make those ideas make sense in an organisational context. And so inheriting those organisational traditions is important to us. At the same time, for every new generation, those old traditions need to be restated in new ways and made to speak to new generations as well. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Perhaps then, before you said in your fondness as you're moving towards the IBT, you said you were sort of won over to the idea of permanent revolution. Mm-hmm. And in some sense, that's one of the old ideas of Trotskyism, but one of the perhaps most debated ideas, and a lot of clashes in global Trotskyism has been over the meaning of permanent revolution, what it means to continue it, how it's changed. How would you understand permanent revolution and what about that theory drew you to the IBT?
Mm-hmm. I mean, its immediate meaning for me was just to smash a lot of Stalinist myths all at once. And, you know, the idea of, you know, Trotskyism being this thing that's only ever going to appeal to the imperial core, that doesn't have anything to say about the colonized countries, when permanent revolution really is a theory of why revolutions occur in the colonized countries and are capable of achieving a worker state as well. You know, that's one side of permanent revolution. The permanent revolution, in a very classical sense of a workers' revolution is possible in alliance with the peasantry and doesn't need to go through a distinct democratic stage. I think that there's also a broader meaning of permanent revolution that is applicable even in a country like New Zealand, which is that we reject this idea of needing to go through a distinct stage prior to a workers' revolution, which you still find social democrats in New Zealand who are like, no, we need to combat neoliberalism first. And this is a very common reformist line around a lot of places. But, you know, we have to first have this kind of workers' uprising through the parliaments against neoliberalism, and then we can worry about socialism. So it's got this broader sense, but I think the permanent revolution in a classical sense is still highly applicable, especially if you're trying to create an international grouping, because, you know, a lot of the ways that Leninist politics do degenerate is through this idea that we have to focus on a strictly democratic struggle or a strictly anti-colonial struggle or a strictly anti-imperial struggle first, build up that politics, and then we'll move on to something else. We're about building these things up together. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And so in some sense there's, again, probably since its inception, Trotskyism has had at its core a kind of critique of Stalinism, right? And particularly in the forms of the political forms, ideological forms, nationalistic forms, etc. How would you understand then, how do you think about Stalinism today, in the sense that one of the sort of founding ideas of Trotskyism early on is that Stalinism would collapse after the end of World War II, and that there would be a possibility for a kind of a genuine Trotskyist internationalism, that the Fourth International only had to survive till 1950 or something, then it could be something. And in a sense that came 50 years late. And the conditions under which the collapse of Stalinism occurred didn't really seem to open the possibilities of a kind of a genuine Trotskyist and international. And in fact, the groups like the ISO that did assume that there could be some hope eventually liquidated in that optimism. So how do you think about Stalinism as a more broader 20th century category?
Yeah, needless to say, Trotsky was a little bit incorrect in his projection about what would happen after World War II, I think.
A little is the maybe understanding.
Yeah, very, very incorrect. But you could sort of you can see where his ideas are coming from, and they're even not entirely kind of the basis of what he was putting them on kind of rings true still in a lot of ways. He underestimated the extent to which the Soviet Union would be able to reconcile itself with imperialism during World War II, to sort of fight on the block of the Western imperialists and sort of weather the storm of inter-imperialist war. He underestimated the extent to which it would be able to keep itself going by sort of relying on the support of the bourgeoisies in the third world post that period. And he underestimated just how worn down the working class of the Soviet Union would have gotten by, admittedly, he did not expect it to go on for 50 more years at that point. So, what was the rest of the question? Sorry.
Stalinism today, perhaps.
Yeah, Stalinism today. You still see Stalinism today, kind of, even we admit it got quite popular on the online left among young people at a certain point, and I mean, definitely still is, but you also see a lack of its ability to really sort of reassert itself.
It hasn't translated into any new parties of note. A lot of that rests on of note, I suppose.
I don't know what it's like here, but we very much in Wellington see a new Stalinist grouping pop up every few years and kind of liquidate itself into something or another and collapse and burn out.
I just did kind of a checks notes kind of moment and looked at, my notes on like the transitional program, and I was like, I just observed this interesting quote by Trotsky where he says, the historical crisis of mankind is reduced to the crisis of the revolutionary leadership. It's interesting that he's observing this kind of this moment of crossroads, in the period in which he's writing, 1938, right before the Second World War, as being this moment that has been conditioned by the rise of fascism and Stalinism, but nonetheless pointing beyond itself in some way. Whereas, could we say that today there is a crisis of revolutionary leadership in quite the same way, or and that isn't a loaded question. The obvious answer might not be just no, but perhaps its roots have extended much further from this moment of 1938. I don't know, just generally what do you think about that?
I think that it's still true in a very broad sense of the objective conditions in a global sense. The proletariat has been built up to be the majority of humanity at this stage. And in that sense, the objective conditions for revolution are filled. It's just that, and by a crisis of leadership, you can interpret that as what is left is a lacking subjective factor. There are not barriers in our way that are not in themselves able to be overcome through subjective development of the class, and the various different kinds of organisational forms that would go along with that development. There is a sense in which it is not as true, which is that in the 1930s there was, existing mass parties of the working class that you could play the base against the tops. And in that sense, the leadership question has receded into first needing to build up that leadership itself rather than there already being a leadership to take out with working in the rank and file of different organisations.
What I find interesting is, so just to be self-referential for a minute. So, what you'll know about Platypus is that we're very interested in the Frankfurt School. We have this kind of eclectic kind of, Trotskyist adjacent sort of thing that a lot of the left likes to peg us with. And, to take that seriously for a minute, that's a product of trying to recognise what the failure of the ultimate failure of 1917 in Trotskyism, Stalinism, Freudian slip. What that produced, has been like the breakup into sectarianism on the one hand, and kind of like the attempt to critically uncover the crisis of Marxism that the Frankfurt School tried to represent. That's kind of like the self-understanding we're trying to recover. And the reason why I asked that is because you mentioned this turn towards what you called Stalinophilia on the left in the modern day. So maybe what's a more interesting question is not like, why are so many young people reaching for communism and the red flag, but rather why is it still plausible to people, however few, to reach for the legacy of Orthodox Trotskyism? And what does that say about this kind of deeper historical crisis?
I think for me, why it has turned from an attraction to Stalinism to attraction to other things?
Just why are people like yourselves and your comrades internationally, why you still like you're younger than those who founded the IBT or the Spartacist League or whoever. So there must be something real in reality that is prompting you to reach for the memory of Orthodox Trotskyism and the memory of the Bolsheviks and trying to take up 1917 as a problem. There is a certain plausibility that is like in reality.
Do you want to go first?
Yeah, I would posit that Trotskyism simply continues to answer a hell of a lot of questions that nothing else can answer. I think really it is the continuity of 1917, it's the continuity of revolution, and that means sort of just a better fighting spirit than any of the rest of the left has right now. I think a understanding that there's nothing that the bourgeoisie can do for us that comes from anything other than pressure on them, and that we can't push the struggle forward by waiting for someone else to come and do that for us. And I think Stalinism, Pavlovism, social democracy, they all sort of reject that little thing in their own very different ways.
You said that Trotskyism answers a number of questions, but would you agree that it also asks a number of questions as well?
I'll answer the first part of the question first. For me, the attraction, I suppose, there is that political attraction in terms of all of the questions answered, but the practical attraction to me was I'd been trying to organise as a communist for many years and had felt extraordinarily directionless in doing that, lacked any kind of anchor in any particular tradition. And I recall a very evocative phrase in a memoir of an old sectarian talking about getting recruited to the old Bolshevism in the 60s, and finding in it a kind of a connection to an older organizational tradition that felt genuinely very alien to everything around him, but also something that just made all of his politics make sense in a new way. And I suppose the thing that immediately attracted to him and made me want to become a supporter of the IBT and organise with them is that whether or not I was going to end up agreeing with this Trotskyism thing for the rest of my life, I knew that I had an extraordinary amount to learn in terms of just the basic practical tasks of organisation, the basic practical tasks of how to build a group and build a party. And that was what kept me in there long enough to actually be one to the politics itself. Yeah.
At our panel yesterday, we had some of our comrades and your comrades from the Spartacist League here, the sort of the original line of the Spartacist League, and they have undergone some transformations recently. I have some questions about that, but Maybe for our audience, could you frame for us the emergence of the Spartacist League in the 60s and 70s, and how, there was also a talk of a Stalinophilia, and perhaps this is what the backdrop was for the emergence of the Spartacist League, in the sense that it was accommodation to Stalinism within the Fourth International, from which Spartacism emerges. How would you sort of frame that if someone was asking you about where does Spartacism come from?
Yeah, so I mean, Max started off talking about this very disorienting moment for Will Trotskyism, which was the failure of all of these predictions in the course of the Second World War. And, you know, Stalinism seemed to be defying the words of Trotsky on so many levels. The creation of the deformed workers' states did not seem possible to many of the people who'd been part of the Fourth International. The spread of revolution in Cuba, led by no party but a petty bourgeois guerrilla outfit, again defied what was seen to be certain core tenets, and was an extremely disorienting moment for a lot of people. And you know, both the victories of Stalinism in World War II, the victory of Castro, created this enormous, a Stalinophilia in that period as well, which led to its mirroring within the Trotskyist movement in the politics of Pablo and Mandel. And there is not much more to Spartacism than an attempt to keep Trotskyism, find a path for Trotskyism that did not result in the same Stalinophilic politics and the same liquidation into the Stalinist and social democratic groups. Or, you know, looking around the world for, is this going to be the Castro of Algeria? And, you know, these external saviors, but rather trying to find a new way of stating Trotskyist politics for that period of disorientation, which meant modifying large parts of it, in fact. And this is the other thing about Orthodoxy. It's not actually just taking everything that Trotsky or Lenin says word for word, but actually trying to make it speak to the present moment. Because if they'd insisted on just saying what Trotskyism was prior to the Second World War, they would not have actually succeeded in making a new pole within Trotskyism away from Pavlovism. Yeah.
One of the sort of fulcrum words of their comments yesterday was this concept of interpenetrated peoples, and that you brought this up, and this seems to be something that will occur all throughout the literature of these discussions. Could you maybe, I think to many in the audience that may have just seemed like an invocation of something that hadn't been discussed, and could you maybe fill us in on how what are the stakes of the claim of interpenetrated peoples?
So yeah, in the talk on the national question, I raised how there were a number of what I called hard cases, things where the traditional Leninist approach to the national question of things are either an imperialist state, a direct colony, or some kind of multinational state in the middle where we just do whatever is necessary to bring about the unity of the class. What the national questions that remain are not so much these easy cases of, well, we just need to support this national liberation movement that clearly wants it, that clearly is capable of creating a new bourgeois state or a new socialist state, worker state rather. But instead, there are these hard cases which include when there are two different peoples which both clearly would be capable of forming a nation in the same territory if it weren't for the other one, if it weren't for another one which has also the same national rights. And it isn't, we don't think our job as Marxists to go, well, this is the more oppressed one, and therefore it has national rights, and therefore it gets all of this territory and it can do whatever it likes to the other one. But we actually have to consider those national rights of the other party, not just on moral grounds, not just because we think that everyone deserves a self-determination, although we also do, but also because considering that right to self-determination for the other party is a necessary part of winning the liberation of the more oppressed party as well. Because, you know, if you are not able to, on some level, engage the Israeli working class, for example, if you're not able to, if our program for them is, you might just get kicked out and there's fuck all we're going to do about it, then we're not actually going to be able to win the critical mass within Israel-Palestine to be able to bring about Palestinian liberation as well. And that's the core of interpenetrated peoples. And the interesting thing is that the Spartacist program, the ICL's program for Israel-Palestine, it's now saying, well, Interpenetrated Peoples is a bogus program because it's all about how we can't have Palestinian liberation, otherwise there'll be a genocide of Israelis. That's bullshit. They still actually have a broadly similar program. It's just that now they say, well, we're emphasising the Palestinians more. And that's not much of a change. That's just posturing, I think.
Would you think that such a theory applies to New Zealand?
That's a very interesting one. So, I mean, at its core, interpenetrated peoples just means two people in the same place. And in that sense, yeah, Māori and Pākehā are interpenetrated peoples in Aotearoa. Whether the program that follows from that would mean that there are national rights for Māori, that's a different kind of question, I suppose, but we would call for, say, a binational Aotearoa New Zealand in the same way that we would call for a binational Israel-Palestine. I think it's a bit different because Māori would not necessarily fulfill all of these criteria of like the traditional European nation, because there are people that were first interacted with before the birth of an autogenous capitalism, which is more the sense in which the national question was first posed in Europe. But I think that there are nonetheless some transferable lessons from that theory to Aotearoa as well.
What I'm interested in is how what might be occasioning this point of difference, and I'm going out on a limb, and you might completely disagree or something, but I know that in the Spartacist League there is a generational shift that's occurring where a lot of they're gaining recruits from younger members and that sort of thing, and I'm interested by the at least superficial. I don't want to claim that there's like some like it's for the same reasons, but the fact that IBT have younger members that they picked up, such as yourselves, in the last few years, and I wonder what you make of that, the new kind of shift that is occurring in the Spartacist League. Does this have much to do with this difference on the national question and recent debates that have been happening between the Spartacists and IBT, and what else you might be able to say to it?
Do you want to take that? So yeah, I think that there are almost certainly similar pressures that are leading to both groups recruiting young people. I think that there is generally a bit of a shift of many young communists towards ideas that are basically more developed than the ones that people were sort of autogenously coming to a couple of years ago. And I think particularly you're noting quite a lot of groups recruiting trans people in large numbers. I think a comrade once pointed out that this is actually a very similar thing that happened with the Bolsheviks and the Jews in Russia, which is, I think Lenin at one point said, if your committee doesn't have a lot of Jews on it, then it's not a good committee. But yeah, I think a similar thing of sharply felt oppression has led a lot of younger trans people into being recruited to some form of more militant left politics. I think that in the case of the ICL, they have benefited from I guess a certain ambient third worldism that is also attractive to a lot of young people. I personally was a bit of a third worldist myself, and I had to be quite sharply broken from that politics before I was brought into Bolshevism. I would think that their politics are a bit closer to that, and perhaps this is more speaking to some of the organic politics of people coming out of that shift to the left in young people.
Very curious.
Yeah, I think now would be a good time for that. So, yeah, raise your hands if you've got a question. We'll start taking from the audience.
You should turn it on at the bottom. It might crackle a bit. There we go. Okay.
I was just wondering, just when you were talking about like interpenetrated peoples in the context of New Zealand, I was wondering if you could talk a bit about your attendance of the Interpenetrated Tendency protests and your statement that came with that, where you talked about sort of like binationalism in a workers' state or something like. What does that mean?
So can you just also explain the protests for people?
Yeah. So the Interpenetrated Tendency were several. There was two of them called by Te Pāti Māori, which is a sort of a petty bourgeois Māori nationalist party, which has a very similar politics to the New Zealand Greens, but it's perhaps a little bit to the left of them. And it's currently there's currently a lot of allusions in TPM, and I think that probably the majority of people identify as left wing in New Zealand would be voting for them, or if not the Greens. But I think that the hikoi themselves were a really important moment, just because they were, a very, very large, very wide-based Māori and Pākehā moment of unity against a really right-wing racist government. And we did actively and enthusiastically participate in these because it's important to participate in a lot of movements with flawed leaderships in order to talk to people and win people to a Marxist perspective, which we think does include a binational workers' state.
Can you just quickly explain what happened with the hikois? Or the hikoi for people that might be overseas listening to this?
Yeah, sure. I don't know much. So
just like what a hikoi is.
Right. So I forget this kind of thing. So a hikoi is just a march, which is typically a bit longer than we think of as a protest march. So in this case, there were people coming from all the way up the top of New Zealand at Te Tai Tokerau, and actually walking throughout the entire length of Aotearoa to Whanganui-Atara or Wellington. This was around the Treaty Principles Bill, which was something put through by the far right ACT Party. It was basically to draw attention away from a lot of other things that they were doing that were in many ways more substantially affecting Māori workers. But the Treaty Principles Bill was never going to win, but it was basically just to redefine all of the principles of Te Tiriti o Waitangi to be whatever ACT wanted it to be, which was, imagine the most standard bourgeois constitution you possibly could, of just equal rights. That was basically what they wanted to make it. There were, I forget how many people there ended up being. Wellington, I think.
Heard estimates of around 50,000 people.
Yeah.
So I think it was
some of the biggest marches in Aotearoa's history.
Maybe the largest.
Quite possibly the largest. Yeah.
Very big. I've never seen the streets like that.
Yeah. And does that kind of convey what was going on there?
Is that? All right. Do you want to pass it back to Brun?
During the Spartacist tradition's revolutionary period, a major part of its politics was the concept of splits and fusions.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that still has any relevance today, and does the IBT still seek to uphold it as a tactic in the recruitment of the communist movement?
Yes, absolutely. So I think that the main path forward for the left, especially in its currently very divided state, very leaderless state, is a process of splits and fusions. What we mean by splits is not necessarily that we come in and we wreck everything involuntarily. We wreck things voluntarily. We try and find people who are wanting to split, who are wanting the more militant politics we want to talk to, and that we want to break away from moving politics, particularly centrism, reformism, social democracy, and win them over to a revolutionary perspective. And they might go through a period of having a faction within another group. It might be something like this. Or we would also want to merge with anyone who is within the sort of realm of programmatic unity, where we would be able to invite them in as a faction, or we would be invited in as a faction. This is the meaning of the process of splits and fusions. Yeah.
Just to add to that, just real quickly, that reminds me of Lenin and the Vanguard Party, the Spartacist text that we read in our main Platypus primary syllabus in Marxism, which makes the point that a split is a precondition for revolution. which, you know, isn't like some like absolute statement, but it is nonetheless like it signals something. And I suppose that just kind of that's kind of what I was driving at earlier when I was talking about, for instance, why it's interesting that IBT takes up the mantle of 1917 and regards 1917 as a problem that persists, and also why I was gesturing at why young people today are reaching for the mantle of Orthodox Trotskyism, and how that might actually be more interesting in a certain way than people reaching for like a Stalinophilic perspective, because that just signals perhaps like a crisis underlying everything. That was kind of a theoretical way I was approaching that. Might people ask that question. Yeah.
Did you have a question, CJ?
Yeah. Ryan kind of brought this up earlier, but I want to kind of restate it in a different way. So Trotskyism kind of originates because of Trotsky wasn't always a Trotskyist. He breaks, very consciously says, okay, we need to split the International after failure in Germany, 1932. Without the objective critique of Stalinism, Trotskyism was very much like a kind of a negative project of saying, we need to do this instead. Do you think without like actually existing like the Soviet Union, do you think without Stalinism, I mean, we have like China, but you know, without the object of Stalinism having a lot of power in the world, do you think that Trotskyism still has a place?
Do you want to take that one?
Yeah, well, obviously I do. I probably wouldn't be here. While the Soviet Union has collapsed, I don't think the actual lessons of the break between Trotsky and Stalin in that time, Trotskyism and Stalinism, the Fourth and the Third International, have really been overcome in the left. You know, there's very much those same problems of everything from sort of inner party democracy in the sort of mid-20s to the orientation of revolutionary parties to national bourgeoisies in colonial countries such as China in 1927, to the fight against fascism, and both the sort of the zigzag of Stalinism between the sort of ultra-left third period down with the Social Democrats, whatever kind of line, versus the later popular frontism, just sort of align with the anti-fascist bourgeoisie and liquidate our politics into that. You know, those are mistakes that are still sort of actively made and actively failed to be grappled with by a great deal of the left properly. Yeah.
The only thing I'd add to that is that we don't just identify as within the tradition of Trotskyism. We're also in the tradition of Spartacism, and insofar as we have an orientation against Pavlovism, and we often find ourselves having to have an orientation against Pavlovism. We're also in the tradition of Leninism, and insofar as we are Leninists, we often have to orient to social democrats and form a pole against social democracy. And we are also in the tradition of Marx, and insofar as we are in that tradition, we have to counterpose ourselves to the liberals and various other bourgeois politics. So there's no, once this thing is gone, we no longer have anything to orient to. We're in all of these, this holistic tradition. Yeah.
Maybe I'll just, before we get them up, add the question there in some sense is, what is Stalinism today? And there is, you mentioned before these sort of various micro-tanky groups that appear and sort of small, liberal nationalists. They are, in one sense, irrelevant, but two, maybe Stalinism vanished from the world because it was no longer necessary. Maybe that instead of the defeat of Stalinism of the 20th century, maybe its ultimate victory was being made redundant. And that once there was kind of a liquidation of Marxism into perhaps a bourgeois liberalism of some kind, that Stalinism is kind of the ambient Marxism now, that meaning that there is the kind of consciousness of the international left is so degraded that there isn't need for some kind of great repressive force. So my question is, how do you think of Stalinism more broadly than just like you mentioned these microsects? Is there like a...
I can see what you're getting at there with it no longer existing because it's not necessary, because it's already forced this overall liquidation and become this ambient force. I can see that. I think it still very much does exist as a wider force beyond these small sects that come and go as well. In that, all groups have to, in some ways, orient themselves to the still extant bureaucracies of the worker states, which are still around. And whether or not these groups identify as Stalinist or whether or not they are even objectively Stalinist, Stalinist politics, that is the politics that comes organically out of the bureaucracies of these worker states, has a huge influence on the left still. The whether or not you're a Dengist, you're still there's still a lot of groups that have some orientation to China. Whether that's an orientation that's too positive or an orientation that's too negative, that's still the effect of Stalinist degeneration on the left. Yeah.
Mark, do you have a question?
By the way, quick question. What's the third worldism and how third worldism is so attractive to the younger generation?
Okay, I wouldn't necessarily stand by my earlier statement that third worldism is particularly attractive. I think it was having a bit of a moment, and there's a sort of ambient third worldism that comes out of wanting to tail national liberation movements, whatever their sort of class character is, wanting to tail the national bourgeoisie of various oppressed countries, and particularly in formerly colonised peoples in the neo-colonies. And yeah, so that's what I mean by third worldism, is just any politics of tailing the national bourgeoisie or tailing oppressed nations generally, whatever their concrete politics is. Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, thanks to both of you. One of the things I really like about the Spartacist writings on Lenin and the Bolsheviks is the emphasis on political differences within the working class. So, for instance, Richard Seymour's Lenin and the Vanguard Party is quite clear that it's not about bringing the whole class together in a single party, but really the divisions in the politics of the working class are really crucial. So I was wondering about how you think about what Trotskyism or the Spartacist tradition gives you in thinking about the political differences within the working class, and how Marxism tries to clarify the politics of the working class.
I think that it's best to illustrate what we mean by political clarification and the importance of these differences by how it practically impacts us. We're organising in a context where there are also social democratic and Cliffite and anarchist outfits in our milieu, and what we mean by clarification is that we are very earnest about the fact that when we have new people come into or we have contacts, we actually want them to go out and look at all of the other politics and earnestly engage with it and come to their own conclusions about what politics they currently feel most proximate to. Then we can have an argument from there about what is the best politics. But we are very serious about this process of political clarification, which is not actually we get everyone into our group. We actually want everyone to find what politics speaks to them now, and that might be seen as sort of building sectarianism, but I don't think that it is. I think that it's actually building also these forums for discussion and for clarification across the left. Yeah.
Jamie, then Arthur.
Amal, you evoked permanent revolution as conditioning the possibilities for whatever the kind of horizon possibilities in the periphery, and as sort of inhabitants of the periphery, like New Zealand, one of the more peripheries, what do you see as the horizon of possibility Could you clarify how that relates to the theory of British revolution?
I think that New Zealand is only the periphery in the sense that it's kind of on the edge of the map. It's still very much a first world imperialist country. It's at the bottom of a lot of the rankings for those kind of countries, but it's very much in the same group, I would say. So, you know, it's an advanced capitalist country, even though it does have a lot more dairy farming. So, you know, there have been Stalinist groups in Aotearoa that have argued for a stagism of first we need to have a democratic revolution based in the dairy farmers, but that doesn't tend to be the meaning that we need to give a permanent revolution in Aotearoa. It's not usually something we raise in its classical meaning, but more as a way of arguing against these newer ideas of first we need to combat neoliberalism, first we need to do this or that, then we can build a socialist revolution later. All of the objective conditions are very much in place for Aotearoa to have a shift towards a workers' state. It would almost certainly be one of the last countries on earth to do that. It would happen as part of an international wave. But yeah, that's how I would see permanent revolution playing out in Aotearoa. In the countries that I think are genuinely neo-colonies, you know, in the Pacific and Africa and Latin America, permanent revolution is still very relevant because it still does get counterposed to this politics of first we need to properly overthrow imperialism, first we need to properly overthrow the exploiters from overseas. And yeah, no, look, they do, but the only way to do it is through socialism. And I think the fact that overthrowing imperialism without socialism is impossible is what gives permanent revolution a lot of its character in the colonised countries. Yeah.
Arthur, and then Brett. I have to wait for the microphone. It's coming.
I was struck by agreement with something that was said earlier about the militants in the 60s would be attracted either to Trots or to Maoists. And I would also, I think those are the two you mentioned, depending on which was the more militant in their environment. And that was true internationally and in different cities of Australia as I experienced it. And it wasn't about fundamental differences in politics, it was about, are you really going to fight? And I would add that there were other tendencies, anarchists, who also, would in some places be more militant. And there's also left social democrats who are sometimes, quite genuinely militant. So I feel a shared commonality with the militancy. Now, I don't understand what you're saying about Stalinism, because there seem to be three concepts mixed in together. One, people who support the various regimes, which I would call fascist, you would probably call them Stalinists. And that I would be more hostile to them than you, because I want to go to war with them. So we've got something in common and something sharply opposed, and I want to get a clarification. Leave aside whether the label is Stalinism or not. To me, I want a clear understanding of the difference between permanent revolution from Trotskyism and uninterrupted revolution from Maoism. I know the verbal difference is purely because Trotskyism used the term permanent revolution, which was Marx's term. I would prefer to use the term permanent revolution too. My concept of Maoist uninterrupted revolution is that you're going to need another revolution. There isn't a socialist revolution which goes all the way to a communist society, that you should expect capitalist restoration, particularly if you're doing it in a backward country like Russia or China. But we can expect that in developed countries too. The revolution continues. There's always going to be a tendency to counter-revolution. And it's not a matter of just the subjective leadership. It's not just the top party people in authority taking the capitalist road. as Trotsky claims, and a lot of Red Guards claim. It's the realities of a society with wage labour. I'd like to understand what you've got to say about that concept of permanent revolution, which is associated with the Maoism of the Cultural Revolution that was defeated. Like, we all share in these defeats. So tell us specifically on that.
I think, for example, there's a certain convergence there between the concept not of permanent revolution, but a political revolution within a deformed worker state that is there to revitalise the revolution and to prevent capitalist restoration in the long run. And I think that there was some potential for a political revolution in the sense that we would use it among certain factions in the Cultural Revolution, particularly the ultra-lefts, who I'd say more than the Red Guards. Although I think that the line between these was sometimes blurred. Ultimately, no one broke with Mao himself, who embodied for us a bureaucratism attempting to itself pose as combating bureaucracy. And the failure of the ultra-lefts in the Cultural Revolution to break with the figure of Mao himself was why the possibility of the...
asking about the Chinese Revolution, but about the concept of permanent, uninterrupted revolution.
Yeah, I was trying to...
necessary political...
Sure, I was trying to get to that through talking about the Cultural Revolution. And so, yeah, you have this concept of permanent revolution, which has some convergence with, I think, uninterrupted revolution. Did I say political or permanent?
Is that which words?
We have a concept of political revolution within a deformed worker state. Permanent revolution is speaking to a different process
but
before
you said
the
ultra-left as supporting the political revolution.
They weren't. I'm saying they weren't supporting the political revolution in our sense. I was saying there was some possibility that the ultra-left might have brought about a political revolution in China.
You don't see the ultra-left as a problem for permanent revolution. In China, they're labelled as like Lin Piao is ultra-left.
Yeah, I'm not using the
military coup.
I forget the exact term in Chinese. Do you want the general theory or the specific thing about China?
Well, I'm wanting you to relate it to the ultra-left here, right? People who pontificate about how left they are are very rarely helpful.
I wasn't using ultra-left in a very general sense. But yeah, so permanent revolution, I'll be brief on this. Permanent revolution is speaking about these problems before the dictatorship of the proletariat. Uninterrupted revolution or a political revolution against a deformed worker state is speaking to problems after the establishment of dictatorship of the proletariat. And I think that's the difference that we're getting at there. Permanent revolution is there are no distinct stages prior to the establishment of dictatorship.
Do you expect a political revolution in these fascist regimes that you call worker states?
We would support a political revolution in our sense of a workers' revolution in these states.
Is a possibility for what we're supporting?
Yes, I think there is a possibility for this in China.
That's Brun, and then CJ.
I had two questions. One of them was going out of my head, so I'll just ask the first one. Hope the second springs to me while I'm asking it. In Australia, the trans struggle has been dominated politically, in my experience at least, definitely in Melbourne, by either Stalinism or the worst form of anarchism. The Trotskyist movement has failed to intervene on any serious level or win over any proper cadre that I know of. And I was wondering how the IBT was able to manage that in Kiwi land and force that break, because it's not something that has emerged here in Australia. And if anything, there are sections that become almost fascist in their hatred for Trotskyism. I can't remember the second one, but it's vaguely intelligent.
I don't precisely know the sort of forces going on in the Australian left in this question, and I can't even an answer to precisely how they'd be combated without some more detail. But I can tell the story of sort of the IBT and the trans struggle in Wellington and sort of how that played out. So a group of radically minded trans activists was sort of called together, queer activists in general actually called together sort of midway through 2021 with in mind the previous year the Pride Parade had I think military nerds will tell me it was
a light armored vehicle.
A light armored vehicle, but anyone that was there would have looked at that and like, that's a tank. Drive right down the middle of the Pride Parade, draped in pride flags. It was, on top of all the usual military cop fare. It was quite revolting to a lot of people, and this was sort of a little group come together in mind of like, how can we stop this? But it kind of ended up sorting itself out, and that there was the Pride Parade just ended up being cancelled that year.
They were too financially incompetent.
Yeah, funding problems, whatever. But suddenly we're this little group, and feels like we should figure out something we can do. And on our radar was a speaking tour by a TERF group called Speak Up for Women. I think kind of a TERFism that has really died down over the years. But the TERFs that were very earnestly trying to convince everyone that they were like just normal, gentle liberals that just have some very serious concerns over this one issue.
They have since forgotten how to be normal.
Yeah, they have all kind of cozied up to the present right-wing government since then. But we kind of got in their heads that, hey, we should try to protest this group. Or at least there were a significant amount of people in that group that were drawn to that direction. There were other people that were more hesitant, more vacillating. It kind of, there was this real serious sort of orthodoxy in the trans community of, we don't protest TERFs because that feeds into their victim complex and turns people against us, and it interrupts our ability to pass nice little reforms in the background. As the sort of event came together, we very much saw the sort of existing NGOs within the sort of transfer get quite mad at us and stuff like that. And this actually genuinely led to a lot of sort of, should we go ahead with this kind of sentiments coming out of a lot of people. But the IBT and some people close to it were very sort of adamant in fighting for the idea that, these sort of things don't just go away by their own. And, when things get worse, it's not sort of having enough sort of nice liberals on our side that is going to save us. It's going to be, having a tradition of, defense and of serious militant mobilization. And the protest went ahead, and it drew about 1,500 people, which is pretty damn good for Wellington. This is not a big city.
That was the first protest of its kind.
We got pretty positive news coverage overall, and Speak Up for Women sort of declined in influence from there. I think they got about 60 people along to their event. We were never trying to shut them down or anything. We let them through, just sort of there as a stark sort of pole of you claim to sort of be this sort of common sense politics. Look at where the public is.
And part of the wedge that we were using there is that a lot of groups that were okay, well, there wasn't groups, a lot of the people who were okay with protesting TERFs thought that they should be treated exactly like fascists, completely shut down, basically go in there and beat them up. And we had to, on that basis, talk to people about, what is the definition of fascism here that we're using. Because, you know, if you did that with a group that's still trying to portray itself as liberal and presentable, you're actually just going to turn its whole milieu against you much more. There's actually people on the fringes of this you can win away, you can break away from it before it becomes qualitatively fascist. And I think that there have been since parts of the TERF movement in Aotearoa that have turned towards fascism, and I mean the Kelly J. Keane protests, not the protests, the Kelly J. Keene's visit kind of helped with that. And so one of the later things we did was we put together a protest against that, which actually got 5,000 people, which was, I think, the biggest that there's ever been for a trans issue. Yeah.
Can I just jump in to add something as well that I find really kind of peculiar and interesting as a phenomenon in New Zealand, and that is that if we're returning to this earlier thread about delineations between Trotskyism and various splits based on certain, political differences. One quite peculiar one is that like a number of like TERF organisations or members in TERF organisations were former Trotskyists from the 80s and that sort of thing. Yeah. So you've got like a number of Mandelites from the Socialist Action League in Aotearoa, and also who was
Redline?
Yeah, is it like Ray Newton, Daphne Whitmore, and that? Yeah, so that sort of thing.
And they were coming out of like the sort of Troc Maoism of Workers' Party things. Yeah.
But like, is it like, do you make anything of that?
Well, I think if there's a through line in that, it's people like moving from various kind of swampy forms of Trotskyism to like a more Radfem inspired politics, and from there to TERFism. And like the Redline people, they were actually anti-feminist to begin with, but then they started strongly tailing radical feminism, mostly because they want to rag on trans people. So I think that's definitely the case with people like Dave Bedgegood, who like very strongly started tailing radical feminism like throughout his whole political career, and so the move to TERFism was a pretty smooth transition.
CJ? Just another question. So when you were talking about sort of splits and regroupments, it kind of read to me as sort of a movementism over partyism. What do you see as the role of both your organisation and the party in a historical sense in building a socialist revolution?
I mean, we're very much for a working class party, but we want a working class party along communist lines, which might coexist with other working class parties that are not along communist lines, and there might be a process of splits and fusions, both at the party level, both at the level of propaganda groups. So splits and fusions is an ongoing process that also encompasses the creation of a working class parties of different kinds of politics. We might enter into a social democratic party as part of that push for one, which is, I think, one way that the struggle in Aotearoa might go, because people would be disillusioned with Labour, with the Greens, with TPM, and push for a working class party. We'd enter into this and try and conduct splits and fusions in this. But we would all ultimately be trying to work towards a communist party with the critical mass able to influence politics at scale.
Is there any more questions to the room? I do have one more, but if anyone has their hands up, we can get to you. I just wanted to maybe another question following on our last engagement from last year. The Spartacist League had been engaging in a series of reconnections with their former splits, particularly the BT in a debate Platypus hosted in London, with the LFI in New York, and then with the IBT here in Melbourne. I was wondering how you maybe reflect on the debate that we held here, but also more broadly, I'm sure you've all watched that series of videos perhaps, or is there any reflections you have on that?
I think the most noticeable thing, the most noticeable difference in the ICL since those early debates, very soon after what they called it reorientation in 2023, is that it seems to me that they have been kind of humbled, not by us or not by any of the other children of Spartacism, but just by the fact that they kind of came out with this this politics that was all about going on the offensive, building up these new forms of politics to then break people away from their leaders, and they had these sort of idiosyncratic formula that they were coming out over and over again with so and so is the driving force of the motive force of revolution, whether that's national liberationism, working with George Galloway, or all of these things. That was, broadly speaking, a politics of very enthusiastic entrism and critical support for everyone, that I think was probably exhausting, which probably did not get them the sudden influence in the working class that they wanted. And what you see in Spartacist number 70, the most recent theoretical journal, is that they've gone back to, well, actually maybe we need to have a more humble propaganda perspective, which is actually it's a little bit closer to our perspective of what our immediate tasks are, but at the same time their degeneration on the national question has gone further, and now they're much closer to, say, the Chinese bureaucracy, and tailing them in various ways. Yeah.
Okay, maybe we'll call it there. Will you hear any questions? Well, let's thank the IBT for coming to Melbourne. And thank you to our audience for coming along as well. We ran